This is Barry, and welcome to the next episode of Simplicity Zen. If you're watching this on YouTube, if you could take a moment and hit the subscribe and alert buttons, that would be very helpful, and like the video. And the reason is that YouTube uses those metrics almost entirely in deciding how widely to distribute these podcasts, so that would be very helpful. If you're like most people, I think the majority of people at this point, and listen to this on one of the podcast apps, you can go to simplicityzen.com and sign up for our mailing list and get updated when we have new episodes. Today, my guest is Dosho Port Roshi. Dosho received Dharma transmission in the Soto Zen lineage from Dainin Katagiri Roshi and inka, or seal of approval, from James Myoun Ford Roshi in the Harada-Yasutani lineage. He also notably studied with legendary Zen master Tangen Harada Roshi in Japan. He's currently the teacher of the online Zen Sangha, Vine of Obstacles. Thank you for joining us today, Roshi.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Did I mangle any of those pronunciations or get anything wrong?
You got it. You got it. Good enough.
The first time for everything. Could you, before we dive in too much, could you describe a little bit about what Vine of Obstacles is and kind of what the experience of participating with it is like?
Sure, happy to do that. So Vine of Obstacles Zen, we're an online community, an online training group, not a Zen center, a training group. And so there are, standards for training that are basically commitments that people make to participate. And there's about 30 students right now. We meet everybody once a week. I co-teach with Tetsugan Sensei, who's also my wife. And so we focus on, depth study and group work together in the online format, and then do in-person sesshin as well. So kind of a mix of both things, but we don't have a building to take care of, which is wonderful. We don't do the whole nonprofit thing. We're just a training group. And so people find us that want to train, and that's what we're about. Not intent on being a church or, a social group or anything like that. We don't have movie nights. We don't do any of that.
There's no pouring sweet tea on baby Jesus at any point or anything like
We do some ceremony, but not so much. That's something that in terms especially of Soto training would be nice to integrate more, but it's difficult to do that online and convey the feeling of it. So we save a lot of that for in-person stuff when we meet for sesshin.
Yeah. So you described it as Sotos. Do you still kind of self-identify as Soto?
Yeah, not really. I saw somebody identify me that way on one of the forums things on Facebook, and it's like, yeah, well, not really. I'm more into one school Zen, and that really goes back to Katagiri Roshi, who thought that we should really focus on going back to the Zen of the sixth ancestor, as he put it. And of course, we can't really go back, but the idea was that before there's a split, what's the essential teaching? And I probably heard him say that when I was, 23 or 24 or something. And it's one of those things that just kind of became a focus for me in my life, is to kind of suss out what that is then, and when he died when I was 33. And so after that, I, traveled around and visited a whole bunch of teachers, mostly in the Soto, a lot in the Harada-Yasutani lineage. On some Rinzai, but really focused on that. And then wound up spending some time with James Ford, but also Melissa Blacker and David Reineck at Bondless Way, part of their teaching pod, studying with their teaching pod, through the Yasutani Harada Koan curriculum. So, and that was a really great experience.
So at Vine of Obstacles, is it mostly like kind of a spoke thing where there's the teachers and then the students have individual relationships with the teachers, or do the kind of the people interact with each other? Is there any sense of sangha where peer
Yes, people interact with each other. That's very important. So there's we focus on zazen study engagement.
Hmm.
And the online thing offers the possibility for actually a lot of engagement. I would say more engagement than most Zen centers, actually any Zen center that I've been a part of, either teaching or as a student, because through the text process that is, a predominant form of communication among the community of students, there's just a much more opportunity to share. You're not just showing up for zazen at the last moment, sitting facing a wall or facing out, and then getting up and going to work right away.
Hmm.
And it's an expectation of participation in the community that people share within the various forums. There's one forum that's just kind of a general forum, and then we usually have a study forum going on that's more of a in-depth look at some text that we're working on. But that sense of community is really important. And we meet for zazen. We have online zazen 4 mornings a week, 4 evenings a week, and then a Sunday session too. So people do actually get to know each other in some ways better than in most in-person communities. Probably not than in residential communities, but probably much more so than folks working in the Zen Center model.
Are
No,
all the students in Vital Obstacles direct students of you or one of the other teachers, or
yes.
are people that are just kind of part of Vital Obstacles haven't yet made the move to being like a disciple, so to speak?
Well, we do offer shoken, but everybody coming in is in a student-teacher relationship with us. Yeah.
Okay.
And when we first started, we've been doing this for, I think, 9 years now.
Hmm.
And when we first started, we experimented with, working with folks that were also involved in other in-person groups, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. But and right now, I can't think if we have anybody that's actually, and of course with the pandemic, I don't think we actually have anybody that's actively participating in other in-person groups. People are free to go to places that they, want to go to, and it's part of the relationship, of course. But what we offer is quite concentrated, so it's not like they have a lot of time on their hands, most of them. So
How often? How many online? I know you don't like to call them sessions. Do you call them retreats, or how often and how long are
yeah, we
those?
call
Do you
the
guys go?
online thing. Oh, you picked up on that. Yeah, I do think, and it's going that way. So it's one of those things that we could quibble about. But I think the sesshin experience, though, is markedly different than in-person retreats or than in online retreats. And not that online retreats aren't, they're kind of a thing of their own. So I just think we should have a different word for it. And in the fall, we'll do 3 online retreats, and then we've got a session coming up in January in Duluth. So,
And so the online retreats, those are early morning to late at night, a
yes,
similar schedule to a session,
yes.
and daily or more often. Um, Dokusan. Do you guys call it Dokusan or Sansan?
When we do meetings online, we usually call them practice meetings. We don't do interviews generally. Practice meetings during the retreats because we're meeting with everybody weekly anyway. So we focus more on sitting, and there's usually a dharma talk. So that's kind of the focus. We try not to be too busy.
Mhm. Do you so clearly you do a lot of online koan work with your students. What do you see as the pluses and minuses? Like obviously the convenience and the ability of people from disparate geographical areas being able to meet with you is a huge plus. I mean, we're unprecedented in the current era of people being able to kind of really find a teacher that resonates with them. I mean, it's unprecedented,
Exactly.
I think.
I think that's the biggest advantage,
Yeah.
and yeah, I think it does work. I was kind of suspicious or reluctant, skeptical starting out that it would work, but found that it actually does. And so I mean, there's pros and cons to everything, and because we have we do 15-minute practice meetings essentially and weekly, and so the advantage also is there's a little bit more time, so in terms of students that are working with koans, we usually do the deal with the koan first. Sometimes there's more time to talk about it, as it were, where we wouldn't do that so much in person dokusan. And it seems to me that spending a little more time is very helpful online because there aren't the same kinds of different, dimensions of communication online as there are in person. So that a little bit more time is really helpful, I think, to connect with people, both for, people in the teaching seat to get a sense where the person's at, but also, I think, for the student too.
Two more questions about it, and then we can move on to some other stuff. The first question is, do you do weekly Dharma talks?
Pretty much.
Yeah,
Yeah, pretty much. Either Tetsugan and I or give a talk, or we have some senior people and student talks that we offer. Yeah,
yeah.
and that's one of the big differences, I think. So I started with Katagiri Roshi in '77, and at that time, pretty much every place in the country, every Zen place was a training group. And of course, there are pros and cons. But one of the things that was a strong positive is that it was very clear that it was for people that wanted to go deeply. Every group, not any difference between Soto and Rinzai or, Sanbo Zen. Every place was really a training group. And so Minnesota Zen Center, we had, I think we had 11 sesshin a year, and, practice periods, even though it was non-residential, from 4:30 in the morning till 7:30, and then go to work and come back in the evening for Zazen. So it was a very focused training. And the whole group of us, and I did that for 13 years, and immersion in Dogen studies. Also, Katagiri Roshi was very passionate about Dogen, and so we had often two, or during practice periods, three talks on Dogen every week. So probably in those 13 years we covered maybe 36 or so fascicles, because he would go like many Soto people do. Like if he got through one sentence, we'd be he got through a sentence in a talk. That's good. So anyway, he went into a lot of depth. So it was a very concentrated training for us. I think an excellent basis for practice. And I see as Zen has become more popular in a sense, it's become more accessible for more people, but at the same time, the actual experience has become less transformational. More about community and belonging needs than about awakening and practicing. That's one of my frequently repeated points about Zen in the world today. And my experience is largely limited to Zen in the U.S.
We'll definitely dive into that. So one more question about finding obstacles. Do you currently have any Dharma? You mentioned, and you actually kind of segued into it nicely by mentioning senior students. Could you talk a little bit about what the role of senior students are in your group, and if you have any Dharma successors at this point?
Well, we have, so we have Shoken students. We're just starting that actually, because we generally considered everybody to be equivalent to a Shoken student in the past, but it got to a point where it seemed like it made sense to offer that. So we're doing that too. Almost everybody in the Vine has done the process for becoming a Shoken student, so it's kind of like we suspected. And there's a couple of the folks that are on the Vine that I've known since the late '70s or early '80s, and we've known each other and been in then student teacher relationship for 20 years or so. So the people I'm thinking of have a lot of experience in training, also practice with Katagiri Roshi, and so. Yeah, of course, people look to them as seniors, and most groups do, I think,
In White Plum, they have the tradition of making people assistant teachers or Hoshi or Dharma holders before they finish the curriculum, and encourage them to offer kind of a beginning koan study, maybe up through Blue Cliff Record. Do you guys have the equivalent, or do you pretty much want someone to finish the curriculum before offering
I
koans?
think it's kind of be case by case probably, but because the I think you really have to do the ranks to really understand what the curriculum is about, that I think for most people it's going to be helpful to do that before they would begin teaching. Now, the ranks could be done at some other time, and although we have the Harada-Yasutani curriculum and pretty much do it as it was handed to us. I think you can also kind of get bogged down in that and kind of make it into some rigid thing. And we see certainly in the tradition, including from Harada Dainin, he was very creative in how he put it together, using part of the Takuju Rinzai system, but then also, of course, including some quite different elements. So I think it's also contingent upon teachers to be more creative than just kind of slavishly going through something like that.
I'm curious, what do you see as the elements he added? So obviously he added transmission of light. He added Book of Serenity. Is that mostly what you're talking about, or are there other aspects too?
Right. Yeah. He the book of the Shoyoroku you're talking about. Yeah. Yeah. And as far as I know, that wasn't offered. And then he also didn't offer things, So the koans from the Rinzai Roku aren't included, and the entangling vines.
And also capping phrases.
Yeah, and capping phrases, right. So he modified the curriculum a lot, and it just happened that the way that he did it made it much more portable so that Westerners could do it much more easily. I doubt very much that he had that in his mind, because he was doing it probably in the 20s, maybe even a little before. So, there weren't a lot of Westerners going to Hoshinji in the 20s. But it just turned out, kind of dumb luck, that what he did wound up to create a system that was, very considerably more accessible for Westerners. You don't have to have you don't have to have fluency in classical Chinese in order to do the system.
So you started off your training with Katagiri Roshi and received his sanction to teach and pass on the Dharma. I'm curious what I'm trying to state this diplomatically, but what motivated you to keep seeking teachers and different modalities after that? Because you were a teacher at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious, where were you that made you kind of keep digging?
Well, for one thing, I was 33, so I had no sense that I was like done, or that I'd seen everything that there was to see. And when he gave us a Dharma transmission, Katagiri Roshi was, dying of cancer, and he said that he told us to do that, to continue our training, find ways to continue our training, and he had given me some marching orders about what he wanted me to do after he died, which I did. But then, that didn't take that long. But after that, I was still interested in training, so I just kept going. And glad I did, and the opportunity to work with Harada-Tangen Roshi was, really an incredible, life-changing experience, and very complementary to the work with Katagiri Roshi, and at the same time quite different. This little kind of rogue band of monastics that gathered around Tangen Roshi. It was very powerful, Zazen practice, So, and koan particularly, he focused on Mu, kind of a one koan system, it seemed, but he also was a really great teacher, as you said. So.
I have kind of a friend / mentor of mine practice with Tangen, and had what would have been a pretty deep opening, and and was able to kind of fully blow through Mu. Kind of was expecting the next koan to come, but nope. Okay, back to Mu. So I think that was kind of his style. What,
He
like,
had evolved that. He himself had, done the whole curriculum, of course, with Harada-Yasutani Roshi, but he focused. It's not exactly clear if that he didn't talk about it, so it's not clear that he did that with everyone. And it
mhm,
seemed that maybe there were some other people that were working on other koans, but he did primarily work with Mu. Yeah.
mhm, yeah. And did so I'm curious if you just real quickly, could you sum up what you feel like you got from that training and kind of what you carried with you? Like what would be different had you not encountered him and lived with him?
Well, one thing that the first thing that I'd say that stood out was that there was an intensity of training that was possible that I hadn't experienced before, and I thought we were pretty intense at the Minnesota Zen Center with Katagiri Roshi, but the nature of the community didn't really allow for that level of intensity. So this kind of monastic practice, where not so many people were coming and going. There were, of course, people in the community that came and, supporters, and we would go on Takahatsu, etc. But it was quite a cloistered group in a sense, and so lots of zazen, very little work. Sometimes, we'd just do 20 minutes of work in the morning cleaning and then, back to zazen. So it was, they were really zazen maniacs, and I loved it.
So it's kind of a samadhi factory.
Yeah, some Samadhi Kensho factory, exactly. Yeah.
Um, so I kind of like to dive in kind of the meat of our interview now. So you're pretty outspoken about feeling that shikantaza or just sitting style practice is maybe not the most efficacious way for a householder to wake up and can integrate that awakening. Could you dive into why that would be? Like, what do you see as kind of what's missing in kind of a shikantaza style practice that you think is kind of filled in by a koan curriculum style practice?
Well, one problem is just that word, shikantaza. So, what does that mean? And you ask different people. I mean, even teachers within the same system, say San Francisco Zen Center, for example, and I hear very different instructions. So the word itself, is not very clear. So that's why I've come to use this phrase, just sitting instead, although it's not, all that much different. The just sitting isn't so much the problem, and Katagiri Roshi, of course, taught just sitting, and for me, he emphasized just sitting with what, the question what, which of course is very much like a koan.
Right. It's inquiry.
But yeah, yeah. The problem with there's two problems I'd say with just sitting. One is that it, especially when just sitting is paired with this philosophy that the sitting is awakening. So this is nonsense. A lot of sitting is just swirling and delusion. So you can believe that if you want, but it's completely out of tune with the Zen tradition. You can pick and choose, passages from Dogen and argue that he said that. If he did, and as I said, largely that's out of context. He also was a Zazen maniac, so he wasn't any focused on awakening. In Shobogenzo, I think, Kokyo Hinkle Sensei did some search in Shobogenzo, and I think is it 1,200 or 1,600 times he uses one of the words for awakening. So Dogen was very focused on awakening, and he wasn't, and clearly if you look at the text, that there was awakening and there's non-awakening. So just to say we're all awakened, so just sit down, breathe, and smile. It might be helpful for some people for some period of time, but it really isn't in tune with the greater tradition of Zen or the Buddha Dharma. So, so you'd have to argue that Dogen wanted to start a new religion, which there's no evidence for. He even denied being a Zen teacher. He was just about the awake truth. He didn't want to use Soto, let alone Zen. So Dogen himself saw himself, in my view, as just re-articulating the essence of the Buddha Dharma that hundreds, if not thousands, of great teachers through the years have expressed. He's a very creative and quirky guy, and so he has this quirky way, brilliant, wonderful way of expression. But it's not something different, So of course, awakening is really important. Shikantaza, if it's taught as this kind of fabricated thing from the Meiji and Showa period, where they're desperate to compete with Protestant religions and they repackage Soto Zen in the image of Protestant churches, and then Westerners are like, oh, that feels right. That's because it was actually, they redesigned it so that Zazen becomes the practice of awakening, which is kind of like this sacrament, and Dogen is kind of like in the role of Jesus Christ, and Shushogi is the practice verification record, which is this cut and paste thing. It's kind of like the Lord's Prayer. They did this very intentionally. Some elements of that, by the way, were very healthy. Women and children who had been living in the temples in Japan were in really bad shape, and that reformation was very helpful. So there were certainly some positives, and it also focused on community in a way that allowed Soto Zen to survive into this century. So it's not all negative. But we're not in Japan, during the Meiji period or Showa period. We don't have to make those adaptations. Also, part of it was mandated by the government. So for us and for me, the greater issue is, what's really helpful for people? Is just another belief system helpful for people? I don't think so. I think all these belief systems are part of the problem. So I think having a personal experience of awakening is really important, and that's what I think we can preserve and hand on to the next generation. Where things are going, it don't look so good. So is somebody in this world in 100 years is this idea that they can just sit down and any sitting for any amount of time is awakening? Is that going to help them? Maybe a little bit, but I think things are so difficult that people are going to be really pressed to be able to live and practice in very difficult circumstances: hot, crowded, tired, hungry, etc. What's going to be really beneficial to the next generation. And I don't think that packaging of the Buddha Dharma is going to be helpful. So I am, as outspoken about it as I can be, I guess. But I don't expect that it's going to have a big effect. But I just keep trying. That's what I can do.
So you've mentioned awakening a couple times, and I'd like to dive into that a little bit. So I'd like you to kind of define it a little bit, and kind of specifically, humans have the capacity, either through samadhi or even psychedelics, to experience reality where there's no feeling of separation between self and other. Right? That's that's not too uncommon a possibility for humans to have. Yet just that experience in isolation is not liberative, right? It's just a state that kind of the brain goes into and out of. How would you compare that with Kensho? Because in the context of me asking this, is you said it's important for people to have like actual Kensho as opposed to kind of just kind of mystical experiences. I'm wondering if you could parse that out a little bit, how you see what you see as the difference.
Right, and you remind me, by the way, so that's also one of the issues with just sitting, is that, first of all, there might not be enough sitting to actually experience any kind of stability, absorption, aka samadhi, in order for the mind to turn over. That's a problem. And samadhi itself, of course, is wonderful and usually a necessary condition for awakening, but it's not sufficient. And the koan introduces the question, which seems to be a really important ingredient in the mind turning. So that's just kind of technically speaking, that's why I think this combination of wholehearted sitting and wholehearted inquiry, which is also a hallmark of the Zen tradition, not just in Dogen but across the lineages, across the tradition, is so powerful. And that's why Da Hui was such a powerful teacher, very focused on Mu and what is Mu, but focused on other koans as well. But just that piercing questioning, I think that's a main thing that we can offer people. Now, what was your? I'm answering the previous.
Yeah, I mean, this is coming out of your most recent blog post where you kind of hint at a differentiation between. You said
Right.
people need to have actual kensho as opposed to kind of other mystical experiences.
Right.
But in your article, you didn't really talk about the taxonomy of these different experiences, like what makes kensho versus kind of more vanilla, non-dual experiences that you can have from samadhi or even psychedelics.
Well, I did try to, but I think one thing that's helpful is distinguishing insight and kensho. So insight experiences, there's something happening to me, so I'm having some experience. It could be some trip of some kind, psychedelically induced, or there's anything that these experiences, human beings actually seem to be like really prone to these kind of insight experiences, where the consensual reality is relaxed, the borders or the boundaries on that, we relax and open in some way. I think falling in love is one of those kinds of experiences. But there's many experiences like that, and there's also experiences that are kind of closer to a kensho that are sometimes mistaken for it. But as long as there is a sense of separation between subject and object, it isn't kensho. So kensho is a radical, abrupt, non-dual embodiment. That's how I describe it. And actually, I think I picked that up from Zen Roshi, who's a successor in the Kapleau lineage, but I haven't been able to find where he said that. So anyway, credit him to the side. I think it's from him, but I think I'm borrowing that. But I think it just very nicely says what kensho is. And then, so also within the koan system, there's, of course, people experience that. Also, people experience kensho not just doing koans, all sorts of ways, and not within Buddhism or anything. The kensho also is an experience that's open for people to, we don't have a copyright or trademark on kensho. People have that kind of opening with some frequency. Not as much, I think, as people sometimes think. But we have within the koan system a method for calling out the really workable elements. So Zen is very practical, very practical. So how can that experience actually help you in daily life? How can it be part of the great vows of carrying beings across? Lots of mystical experience actually separate the experiencer from the world and elevate the experiencer. I'm something special,
I'm part of the universe.
Yeah, I am exactly. So that
I
kind
am
of,
God.
yeah, exactly. So, and also they can drift into dysfunction. But kensho is very practical. So that's the koan work, is to call out that practical part. And we actually don't consider and experience kensho. It's what you can do that's kensho. So Victor Hogan Sori says, or is it Sogan Hori? Yeah, talks about how it's a verb, kensho, and if you can kensho this, yeah. So that's the process. So it's a very powerful practice, and it's a way of practicing awakening, and along that process also it's important for almost everybody. Almost no one has one kensho like experience and they're done. Almost everybody has multiple experiences, and you can see that also in the texts in the ancient times. Most people get a little taste and then continue practice, and further openings come about. So the kensho process, the koan process, is specifically designed to facilitate that. In what's become of Soto Zen, there are elements of monastic training that I think can do the same thing. But almost nobody's doing monasticism now. I mean, really, there's maybe 200 or 300 people in Japan, and probably less outside of Japan. So very small group, and historically probably there are fewer people, just numbers, not even proportion, but there are fewer numbers in monastic communities now than there have been since the time of the Buddha. We're at an all-time low. And at the same time, there's more householder people that are interested in practice. So it does seem to me, and this is, of course, congruent with my experience in doing teaching for 20 years and just sitting Zen, and then working as a teacher with that koan in the toolbox as well. It's really portable. And, Dahui, that's the reason Dahui created this kind of focus on the keyword, is to help people that were engaged in busy lives, do this kind of deep
All
work.
Dawi's letters were to lay people, as far as I know.
They're all the lay people, right? And there's a case of a guy who says something like, he's a high level minister, and he's like, well, Dahui, I'm going to, quit my job and go to the monastery because I really want to get to the bottom of this. And Dahui says, well, that would be a big mistake. Because the material that you're working with is so important. That's where your practice is. So don't do that. And we also, strangely, when we studied this a few years ago, people were kind of shocked. He's like, you can sit if you want to, but it's for people that are immersed in Dogen studies that really emphasizes Zazen, he's like, yeah, Zazen, you can take it or leave it.
Well, I think his point there was, always maintain your awareness, not just while you're sitting.
Exactly. That's his point. And
not that samadhi wasn't important. It was just everything should be samadhi.
Exactly. And he's, at the same time, he is, working with a bunch of monastics who are doing what we would consider sesshin like Zazen all the time. So it's not that he's opposed to Zazen, but for householders, he is emphasizing, the active samadhi. Yeah.
So you mentioned kind of multiple kenshos. So are you familiar with Chinol, the Korean Zen master?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. So he goes into like great pains of like kind of mapping out different potential paths of practice, and he differentiates kind of the initial kind of what you could almost call the stream entry kensho awakening, with kind of like the final like the opening that kind of resolves you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he in his maps, in his opinion, you kind of always need that kind of initial sudden, and then, but in his opinion, you can have the initial sudden opening, but then kind of gradually come to resolution, right? To contrast that, would be like kind of contemporary Sambo Zen, where they seem to really strongly believe, you need to have your initial kind of stream entry realization, but then you need to have a final kind of like not just the bottom of the bucket drops out, but there's just no more bucket type of final resolution. I'm curious where you've like your view of kind of schemas of practice. Like, do you think both are a possibility? Do you think you lean towards one or the other, or?
Well, yeah, I do lean toward. I mean, I think so. In the 10 ox sorting pictures, for example, it kind of embodies that in my view. So that you have, the third stage, you have some breakthrough, and then you have gradual practice, and then with the eighth stage, you have, a more definitive awakening, or the definitive awakening. And so, I think that that's pretty powerful and very descriptive of a lot of people's process. You also see that historically. I've been interested in this 13th century and kind of broadening our sense of the Zen tradition. So, with the Record of Empty Hall, there's Jutong, and his process very much like that. Wansong, who's a Sadong Soto master, about the same time, his process also almost exactly like that. Also working with koan and keyword. So very similar kinds of processes. Now, could there be exceptions to that? Sure. I mean, I think humans are varied. So there probably are multiple paths to having some sense of completion.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people don't. A lot of people who don't have those definitive experiences don't necessarily feel like they're complete.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's kind of a problem in this work, actually. That that's, as a teacher, I'd like everybody to be able to have these kenshos in this kind of way, but it doesn't seem to actually happen for some folks like that. So then what? I think, and sometimes, the aspiration, the method, and the application, are all, very strong, or at least as strong as someone who has these opening experiences. What's different? You can say, well, somebody's karma, but there's not necessarily actionable steps by just dismissing it in that way.
Yeah, some people certainly seem to have more predilection towards that for just whatever reason.
Yeah, we call it experience prone, and some people are much more experience prone than others. So I mean, it does get back to the nature of the experience necessarily isn't, or the power of the experience, let's say, isn't as important in this work as what you can do. So, and that I think levels it. Although there's so much said, and including by people like me, about the importance of these opening experiences, that people that tend not to be experience prone, have problems with it. So it's something, just I think, it's kind of the underside of the tradition and of focusing on kensho.
Kind of on a related topic. So I've been lucky to chat with Henry Schuckman a couple times. Are you familiar with Henry? Down in
Yeah. I know Henry.
And one thing, we were just kind of chatting once, and he mentioned to me that when he gets new students, he always wants them to have a fresh kensho to work with, like regardless of their practice paths. He always wants them to kind of dive into Mu again and kind of have a fresh opening, so it's kind of more of a living reality to progress. Like, I'm curious what your as a koan teacher, what your opinion is of that. And I think that might be something kind of unique to modern Sambo, because I haven't heard that from other teachers.
Yeah, well, I mean, ideally, that sounds great, but Kensho doesn't always happen in quite that way, that we can like control. But I like the idea. We find ourselves actually with people that come from having done some koan work in the past. We stress the basics a lot more than some lineages. So for a lot of people, they come in. It doesn't matter what they've experienced before. If there isn't a fluency with the breath and samadhi, then just having had some kensho, or at least some kind of first koan that was passed through with previous teachers, doesn't mean so much. So often we find ourselves, focusing on some of the basics, basic Dharma perspective also. So we want people to, settle into that and have a working relationship. And we also, we start people, everybody that comes, as far as I can remember, we start them at the beginning of the system. So even if they're deep into the process, we want to go through it again. For some people, that's a problem, but then we're not the right folks for them.
Yeah. So you've talked a little bit about, in your recent article. So a lot of your constructive criticism kind of is towards the, I think what you call the just sitting crowd. In your more recent article, you kind of draw out some areas of you see as potential improvement in kind of the wider koan community. Could you spend a little bit of time detailing that? What you kind of see as maybe some deficiencies in some lineages?
Well, I think that, as we've been talking, and Wu Men says, for example, practice must be real practice. Satori must be real satori. So kind of just the basics. And I think we've drifted from the basics in the last 50 years in the West, and probably just a normal, natural kind of thing. But we also have this thing about leveling downward, which I mentioned in the article. But of course, we want to be accessible to everybody, and that's great. And so we make compromises. And I think there's some real cost to those compromises because in a way, it makes it more difficult for people to go, as deeply as actually necessary to really practice with the experience.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think that's the main criticism is that, and there's also I think a tendency, similarly in Western Buddhism, to kind of be an amalgamation of all sorts of stuff, which
Mhm.
there's nothing wrong with that in itself. But if we somehow forget the basic Dharma perspective, then the koan and zazen generally, it works differently because following the breath within Christianity is a different practice than following the breath within the Buddha Dharma because the narrative concept and not narrative construct and understanding of what's happening is different. It changes the practice. Everything is, of course. So that basic perspective and the analysis of the Four Truths and the Four Seals and these kinds of things are not things that can just be dispensed with and have some other kind of understanding that's based on liberal values or something.
What on that topic? What do you think about? It's pretty common in contemporary Western Buddhism for people not to literally believe in um, rebirth and karma and so forth. Do you think it's possible to have a culminating path of awakening and not believe in that type of stuff? Like, does what right view? I mean, does right view have to include those aspects? Do you think, or do you think it's kind of it's okay to be agnostic about it?
Well, of course, it's okay. People can believe what they want. I think it's very helpful to believe in karma. And I think it's helpful to believe in some continuation of the energy and the life stream. I think those are very helpful. I think in the past, of course, there's been this kind of medieval framing around things like rebirth and things like that that probably make it, they don't communicate the message so well. So do you have to believe that if you kick a dog, you'll be born in the next life with a short leg or something as a consequence of that? I'd say no. So I don't think that kind of literal concreteness is necessary, but that there is some. It's basically it's not any different than the teaching of non-self. That there is this flow of life. I think that we call karma and rebirth. I think that it's really helpful to believe in that. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Sorry for interrupting your thought.
no problem.
Yeah. So we're kind of getting towards the end of our interview here. Is there anything else you'd like to touch upon?
Nothing comes to mind. I think that
Okay.
we're in this stage, of course, and Buddhism is just kind of getting going here. It's unclear whether it's going to get going or continue or not. A lot of folks are the graying of the Buddha Dharma and all that. So not completely. There are some younger people too, but I think lots of dialogue about what's really most important is important. And the more we cling to beliefs, the less helpful that is, I think, both in the present and in the future.
Great. If someone wanted to get a hold of you, what's the best method for that?
The Vine of Obstacles Zen website has contact forms, so that'd be a great way to communicate. Yeah, or Facebook. I'm on Facebook.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.